let's jump in with Sommer and Rickesh about Sommer. Why did you decide to do this presentation for CCF as part of our programming for June?
Thanks, Jenny. So I think it probably is helpful if I give a little context to Jenny's question and to why both myself and Rickesh decided to do this presentation. But I am a lifelong fundraiser. I've been fundraising in Southeast Michigan probably for nearly 20 years. And this past August, I took a role as executive director for a small nonprofit here in my hometown. And I immediately came on board and realized that there's no way that I can kind of shift from being a community-centric fundraiser to not being a community-centric leader as an executive director. And I just have kind of embraced the role by sort of filtering all my decision-making through the lens of community-centric fundraising. For me, it's a way of life. It's kind of like living and breathing these principles and these values and having them inform, my decision-making as a leader. So I decided to do this presentation because Rickesh and I and others were constantly coming up against, it's not like certain things were just germane to fundraising. I was seeing all kind of parallels in how I made leadership decisions that were impacted by community-centric fundraising principles and values. So we thought it would be helpful to kind of share our thoughts and how we've been kind of moving and shaking in community-centric fundraising as leaders. So that's why I decided to do this. Thank you, Jenny.
Great. And Rickesh, maybe you could just provide an intro to yourself.
Sure thing. And I'm just me, Jenny. I feel like we're cutting in and out. That's all good. We'll make it work. It might just be my end. Sorry, I'm just getting in the middle, up and down from a bit of a flu type bug thing, but that's the beauty of these virtual sessions is I can still be here and I'm feeling up to it. And I'm excited to be here today. Thanks for everybody for coming. I'm a big believer in the community centric fundraising movement. It was like, there's just always felt like there's certain things I didn't like about the way that we do things. And then this CCF was a way that really just named it and shaped it and also gave us a path to be able to move forward in a different kind of way. That's what I really appreciate about it. And why this topic struck me as interesting was, I mean, not just like Sommer, I've been in this space for, I used to say over 15 years. Now it's like almost 20. I should probably say that instead, in this social impact, nonprofit, charity sector, whatever you want to call it, and pretty much fundraising the whole time. I did start out fundraising, and then I spent 8 years as an ED of a small community-based organization. So in that case, that means you're doing a lot of fundraising still. I call myself a recovering ED now, but I totally understand like why this topic is interesting, because not only do we want to talk to people who are in leadership roles and say how you can shape this and do and take a critical lens to your organization and your fundraising efforts, but also to speak to people who are trying to influence people within the organization. Sometimes folks with, we're in a hierarchical structure, decision-making power, and you're like, I want these things to happen, but I need support from leadership and management in many cases to make that happen. So this topic was very interesting to me, having been in that role and also trying to influence leadership in this very important work.
Thanks to you both. My internet situation may be rocky, so rating isn't helping. Just let me know. But the first question we had for you all was, what does the CCF movement mean to nonprofit leaders who are not fundraisers?
You want me to, so how are we doing this? Are we both answering the questions, or maybe we just pick and choose if both people need to respond? I don't know, but I can take this one, Rickesh. Okay. Well, to nonprofit leaders who are not fundraisers. So when I look at community-centric fundraising, mainly the values, right? To me, my leadership is informed by all the same values that community-centric fundraising embraces, right? So equity. I entered this role thinking about pay equity for my employees. I immediately did research on comparable salaries in the area, things like that, to make sure that my staff was being paid equitably. I'm constantly having tough conversations with our board members, whether it's around mission creep, adding programs that haven't been requested by our community to our work. There's all types of instances where I have to be courageous and have tough conversations with board members and stakeholders around the work that we do, centering on community. A little bit about the nonprofit I work for is Accent Pontiac. We are a music program, but music is the vehicle. Our real goal is social change for youth in Pontiac, Michigan. We want them to be seen as leaders in their community. We want to empower them. So music is just the vehicle that we're using to build character, to develop leadership skills. So quite frankly, we don't care if kids ever achieve any musical growth. We're targeting and tracking growth in their character, growth and their ability to lead, whether they've had exposure to leadership opportunities and how they're changed from that. So there's always, in addition to that, to how our program works, we partner with the local school district here in Pontiac. So when it comes to our program, although our mission is very important, right? Social change for music is important in the work that we do, but we understand that the Pontiac School District is the bigger community player and bigger community partner in this whole scope of what we're doing. So we don't just focus and prioritize what's important to our organization. We take into account what the needs are for the Pontiac School District and how we can best be a community partner to them. Of course, everything we do is with the utmost integrity. And then movement building. It's important to me that our organization is not just a hamster wheel that's sort of perpetuating the same circumstances that we're trying to fight against with our nonprofit. So for me, the social change component of what we do is around sort of building a movement towards changing the dynamic for youth in Pontiac, but also the movement building of community centric fundraising. I feel like when we kind of model these examples and these behaviors, we're promoting the movement and we're helping to advance community centric fundraising. I know that was a lot.
That was great. It's really helpful to hear that context, Sommer. Like, even we know each other, I'm still learning lots about my colleagues on this global council. I want to add to that as well and build on what you're saying, Sommer, too, that for me, fundraising is sometimes seen as this icky thing off to the side for a lot of folks. I mean, I talk to so many folks who are in nonprofit leadership roles, and they, first of all, don't see themselves as fundraisers, and they are also don't want to engage with it. And there's many reasons for that. And that's understandable, and we want to try to work through those. But a lot of times, sometimes the reasons are because it's like this complex relationship with money and power and wealth, and it's like highly imperfect. And how do we deal with that? And unfortunately, it's not going to go away just by ignoring it. So I feel like for leaders in this space, embracing that fundraising, is not something to be intimidated by. It's something you can work through. But even though it's imperfect, fundraising can be used as activism. And so how do we use fundraising as a way to activate people to take behaviors in interest of the work that we're trying to do? That's really what it is. It's a series of conversations. It's motivating people the way you would want them to volunteer or to share the programming that you're doing or whatever the case would be. It's just very similar, but there's this kind of like, that's what I really feel like for this movement. It's like, how can we both get everyone seeing that fundraising is part of all of our roles to rally resources around the work we're doing, but also how can we do it in a way that is aligned with our values and feels like, hey, we're doing this in a way that represents and doesn't contradict with some of the things our organization is trying to do in terms of our programming work. So if you're a leader in this space, it's like, you might not be a fundraiser. First of all, I argue that if you're a nonprofit leader, you're our fundraiser. If fundraising means letting people know that your organization exists, that you're doing great work, inviting people to be part of it, that's part of fundraising too. So I feel like everyone has a bit of a role in it. And so that's why I feel like CCF is great, because whatever your reason is, whether it's you're intimidated by it or because you're like uncomfortable with the imperfect aspect of money and wealth and power, you can kind of address both of those things through CCF. So it's a really great platform.
Fantastic answers, both of you. Maybe you've already addressed this somewhat, but is there anything more to add about what it means to be a community solution?
I got something to add there, because I think I mentioned earlier that this is my first role as an executive director for an organization. So I think I was in this role for 10 days before I realized that in order for me or for this organization to be a community-centric organization, that we first have to be employee-centric. So that was my first kind of like, oh, idea, light bulb moment, right? Is that how do I center on my community if I'm not first prioritizing and centering on the employees that work here? Because they're members of this organization's community as well, right? So when I think about things, one of the first kind of things I spearheaded in this new role was getting pay increases for salary members. There were people working at my organization whose salary had been the same for 7 years. And so that was unfortunate that happened under past leadership, but I was like, there's no way that this can go on because it impacts so much, right? It's going to impact succession. It's going to impact if this person leaves, how am I going to rehire and replace this position when it's drastically underpaid, right? Like, so there's so many things. Thinking about one of the things we implemented was live scan digital fingerprinting because our organization works with youth. And I think about my experience as an employee, like it's always been my lens as I think about what my experiences have been as a nonprofit employee and what would I have liked to have seen different. So things like coming out of pocket to pay for my fingerprinting and then waiting a month to be reimbursed by the organization. I was like, nope, we're not doing that. We're going to use the company credit card and we're going to schedule all these appointments and we're going to pay for it up front, right? So just small things, right? We paid for an appointment for an employee whose car broke down and then they couldn't make it. I paid for it again. Like, like we do all of these things that are kind of like punitive to employees. We're not centered on what their experience is like. So to me, all of those things are important. I take their feedback on program, on things that, they want to see different or things that they have marked as areas of improvement for the way we do our work. I take all of those things seriously. So to me, it means to me to be a community-centric institution is to first be an employee-centric institution because all of that kind of trickles down.
Here on that, Sommer, like that's the part that really bothers me in terms of, remember I was saying some of the things that just were feeling off about this space is the blatant hypocrisy that we all acknowledge in this space. It's like and these are unfortunately real examples, a gender justice organization that is underpaying women, or a disability rights organization that refused its own team members' requests for reasonable accommodations. And who's defining even what reasonable is? This is happening all the times. And so to me, the main part of this is, well, first of all, even the word institution, if by the institution, we're talking about like crushing hierarchies and we're talking about, status, upholding status quo, then maybe we're not supposed to be an institution at all. So it's a very interesting, or even word, do we even want to be an institution in our organizations, but also aligning what we do, say on the outside with what we're doing very much on the inside. So I agree with you, Sommer. It starts in our own walls. And if we don't fix that, the hypocrisy for our own team members who drive so much of this work. A lot of people in the movements stay, a lot of them come and go, but your team members are like, they're the core of a lot of stuff, whoever you define as your team, are driving a lot of this work forward. So it's hard because I understand, let's say if you're in a leadership role or a decision-making role, you have to balance the realities of like, I have to manage a budget and I have to manage the realities of working with a board and I can't just do everything I want to do right now. But do you acknowledge that some of the things you have been doing or are currently doing are problematic? Do you identify them? If you identified steps to make it better and have a plan to move forward and then try and resource it and then make that happen. So for example, sometimes that means going against the grain when you sometimes have a board of folks and they're, what do? We often pile on a lot of corporate folks onto our boards. I'm not being inherently critical of anyone who works in a corporation, but if we only load up our board with corporate folks who don't have any community experience that's relatable or valid to the cause, they're probably going to come in with the growth. We got to keep growing at all costs, more programming, more this, hire more people, get more like programs in place, increase the numbers. And at the same time, we're doing that on the basis of like hurting our team members in the process. So it's like, what if we say, let's invest in our organization so it can be a better place to work. We keep people longer because that's going to help for relationships and for well-being. And we make that strategic decision to invest in ourselves with zero increase in external programming. Now I know needs and everything are growing up, demands is growing up, but like to be the institution, you have to make tough decisions that don't necessarily just cater to the sort of external pressures. It's like we have to do what's right. And if your core is strong, then you're going to flourish. So that's how I would define like as a CCF, like a community centric institution. It's like community. I agree, Sommer. Communities starts within.
You're absolutely right, Rickesh. Like I think about last summer when I was interim in this role, right? So I came in as we were beginning summer programming as the interim executive director. So I'm trying to like observe, not make any changes, keep the ship afloat, right? We must have done 20 performances and events with our students that summer. Staff was completely burned out. There were like some weeks there was 3 and 4 different programs that we had to do. And so my operations director at the time, she came to me and she was like, this was tough. She was like, can we put a limit on how many performances we do each week? And I was like, we certainly can. It's 2 is the max because staff is exhausted if we do more than that. So for me, damn how many requests we get from the community, damn how many more performances our board wants to see us do. My staff is happy doing 2. Kids are still getting the exposure. Our mission is still being fulfilled, but staff is happier. So to me, that's the choice we made.
You'll examples already of how you as organizational leaders are living and breathing CCF. Are there more here that you had flagged that you wanted to talk about?
Oh, you know what I put on this slide to talk about? Being employee centric, and I already talked about that. But I will add that as a leader, I operate through this lens of CCF. So I'm like looking for opportunities to challenge the status quo. I'm looking for things that are not in alignment with CCF practices. I'm putting myself in the shoes of my parents, of my students, of my employees, and I'm thinking about what's going to shape and make the best experience for me, for that particular stakeholder. So I'm always, right now our organization will be 10 in 2026. So as I kind of like gear up to that, I'm thinking about fundraising events, things that are going to happen in our community to celebrate that. And the one grand idea I have is doing a fundraiser, an arts-focused fundraiser, bringing together other arts organizations in my city and doing one fundraiser. I'm like, I know my board is going to go nuts, right? But I don't care. Because in a lot of ways we have more donors. We're more established of an arts organization here in the city. But to me, it is going to give us access and exposure to others who don't know about us, who perhaps could have an interest in our work because they support other arts organizations. And for me, it's something we should be doing, right? It's something we should be doing for our community. That's what you should be doing for your donors, is giving them access to other things they might be interested in supporting that is still in line with your mission. So, to me, these are things we should just be doing. Same thing I mentioned earlier, we're a music organization. We provide guest artist experiences for our students, performance opportunities. We're going right here, homegrown. I'm looking for talent right here in the city of Pontiac to provide those guest artist experiences for our students, because that's our role too. We should be supporting the vibrant arts community that already exists here in our community. We shouldn't be seeking, this outside kind of, not to say that we don't bring in guest artists from outside of our community, but we're super interested in putting talent in front of our kids that look like them and for supporting the community that's right here in our hometown. So to me, that's all living and breathing CCF, right?
Yeah, I touch on like something interesting, Summer. It's like those day-to-day things that happen. I mean, to me, I hear a lot of people talking about what CCF is and the theory and the principles, which is awesome. We want people to talk about the principles, the values of what it is. And then where we want to really figure out is like, how do you embody that on a day-to-day basis, especially if it's something that's new to you or the concepts of this. So to me, it's like, it is, you talked about that lens that you're wearing. It's like a critical lens on everything you're doing. To me, this always comes down to literally what's happening on a day-to-day. So again, we talk about internally, but even externally too, what are people's experience of you and the organization? So if you're saying, oh, we're, I've seen orgs do this. They're like, we're embodying, CCF principles, and then I'm facilitating a discussion with a group and the fundraising team, for example, and someone's like, well, what about that donor that did this thing? And we kind of like let it go and whatever. And in that moment, the leader can do one of two things. They can either, well, probably three things. One is they can, react very harshly and like, attack. The other is they can kind of just like, support and sort of be, and be like, oh my gosh, let's talk about that. I want to learn more. I want to be curious. That's what we would want to see, right? But I often see they're just kind of like, let's just sweep that under the rug. Like, oh, they're not here. Let's take that offline or something like that. Corporate speak. I'm like, they turn into like this almost this corporate robot type of thing. And again, I'm not poo-pooing on like corporations, but like just this kind of like it's not coming at that place of empathy. So to me, it's like, what is people's experience of you and your organization on a day-to-day basis? So that's what I really think about is like, is everything I'm doing right now aligned with what people are believing we're supposed to be doing? And so like in that situation was a perfect opportunity for the leader to build that trust and say, hey, this donor did something problematic. Tell me more about it. Maybe they didn't hear about it. And let's get curious. Let's have that conversation. We want to address that. We don't want to allow that to happen in our organization, because no matter what we say publicly, if, as we know happens in the fundraising field, especially when there's so many women in the space, there's all kinds of things going on, racism, sexual harassment, so many things are happening. And if you're willing to sweep that under the rug, then it doesn't matter what you say, really. So that's, to me, the living and breathing part is every day-to-day action and behavior, and hopefully understanding of the overall broader piece. But it's really that's because that's actually people's experience, right? That's how they experience you. Whatever comes out of your mouth, what's happening on the day-to-day within your organization is how people are actually living it. And when those two things are not like aligned together, when they're far apart from each other, that's when you find organizations really struggling to succeed and to keep people employed and to have well-being as intact as possible.
That's so valid, Rickesh. And it reminds me of, I feel like we've got that lens too, and we got people watching us from outside of the community. And there's community leaders. I think about our organization. For 7 years, this organization was led by outside leadership, a woman who lived maybe 60 miles from here and kind of commuted to Pontiac to do her job. The doors that opened when someone from this community took the leadership role was amazing to see, because I think the community just wanted to see that. I think that that's something to be, I guess, coveted by the community, to say that this organization is being led by someone from this community. They embraced that, and I think it made the community feel better. The second thing I'm going to say about that is our organization, we've been very lucky to have reserves. We report this on our financial statements. It's not a secret that our organization has $1 million of reserves in the bank. But then when we go and perform, our staff members were complaining about students outgrowing instruments, student who began performances on student level instruments. They now needed to be kind of upgraded to an intermediate level instrument. I'm not a musician, so I'm just like repeating. They would say, oh, this instrument has been repaired so many times, it's beyond repair, like we just need to trash it. It can't be repaired anymore. And here I am like, how are we talking about our instruments being in a state of disrepair and needing to invest in instruments, but we got $1 million in the bank? And I'm like, that's bull. Like, quite frankly, I'm like, I'm not willing to be the leader of an organization that's going to allow children to play on subpar instruments while we're sitting on $1 million, while our board is over here playing investment games with the money. And I'm like, look, fine, like invest the money, do that. But what we're not going to do is cause our students to play on subpar instruments when we have the money sitting here to be able. And to me, that's something that people are looking at too. Like, how dare you have $1 million in reserves, but then you got kids out here playing on these raggedy instruments. Like, to me, it was important for me not to allow that to happen under my watch. And to me, that's part of living and breathing CCF. It's the organization is supposed to serve the community and the kids that are participating in our program. Like, how dare we not be serving them to the greatest ability that we can when we have the financial resources to do so.
It looks repetitive. I don't know if it's stimulating for you all. Other thoughts, or should we move on to the next?
I mean, we're talking about like personally informed my leadership. I mean, there's definitely a couple pieces here from the specific question, but I want, first of all, what you were saying somewhere around the instruments. I mean, ditto computers, right? We have those computers where we like have to turn them on, go walk around the block, have a coffee, and come back, and maybe then it'll start up for you. It's like, why do we do that? So I think part of CCF has been the belief, the true belief, that we don't have to keep doing more with less. The idea that our team members, anyone involved with the organization, is worthy of the abundance that of thinking that we have to shake off the scarcity mindset that we inherited and that we also reinforce. So I get it. It's like pressure is put on us to like do the most you can, get the most bang for your buck. I hate that phrase when it comes to like programming. And I've heard people use that in the context of the most inappropriate types of social services. I'm like, can we not talk about bang for your buck? Like, this is not what it's about. And so the idea that we don't investing in our own infrastructure, investing in, community outreach efforts, investing in these things that maybe don't have the same visible, kind of influence on an organization's sort of reputation or what have you, to attract funders or to build reputation and all that. Those are things that often drive organizations, and I understand why that's come to be. But it's like, how do we kind of move away from that? I want to just share something too in the chat, and I'll read it out. The culture of any organization is shaped by the worst behavior the leader is willing to tolerate. That's by Steve Gruner and Todd Whitaker. It's actually about a book about school, but it's like, for me, it's like, that's the baseline indicator. So I think for my nonprofit leadership, it's meant that I've had to put my neck out and like talk to board members that have done problematic things. Whereas normally it's a very complicated place for ED to do that. And normally it's like board to board, but it's like sometimes it's just not going to happen, or in the way that you want, or you've got a relationship where you can do that. So I've like, and I've paid the price for that sometimes, but it's like, someone did something to a team member. They told me about it, and I'm like, okay, thank you. It's a board member. I don't care who you are. And that's really hard to do, I think, for leaders. It's like you get put in this weird spot and you're like, well, I have power as an ED or a CEO or whatever, senior leader, or whatever your role is, but then I also have like this other group that's kind of in the mix. And what happens if they're causing some of the problems? And so that's the part that I think has informed me the most, is really kind of just taking a breath and like leaning into those issues where I think a lot of leaders, and again, I understand why, just push those things away. So in fundraising, whether it's like donors or board, well, we can't say anything to them because they give a lot of money. We don't want to risk that relationship. Well, what about what they just did? Is there no accountability for that? And I'm not oversimplifying. I get why these things are multi-layered and complicated, but if we're not even thinking about it and taking a critical lens to everything, and that includes like not just fundraising, right? But this lens, it's easier to apply to programming, but like, how can we apply it to budgeting, to finance, to marketing, to every aspect of what our organization does? And that's a little bit harder. So I think it's not only, if we can do this with fundraising, I'm like, we can do this in all aspects of our organization, especially HR. So I think that's another way that CCF has given me tools and guidelines that actually can apply into other areas of an organization as well.
You're so right, Rickesh. And I think about, I challenge those on the call to do this. Review your organization's bylaws through a CCF lens. See what you come back with. Because I'll tell you, when I did it here at my organization, the first thing I saw was that whoever wrote these bylaws was protecting this organization from the community it serves. That's how the bylaws read. I mean, it was completely from things around spending limits, like, example, executive director had to get 2 signatures on any expenditure over $2,500 on a check, even if the expenditure was already approved in the budget. What? Like, why are we repeating and reinventing? Like, you already gave approval for that. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. And, we were founded out of a mission and outreach project of a local church, or a church in a prominent suburb of Pontiac. So the bylaws were written so that this church would always have input. It required a number of board members to come from the church. It just up and down. Let's protect this organization from the community of Pontiac because they don't have the wherewithal to lead this organization. So it was all types of things kind of put in place to ensure that this church would always have some control. And I called it out. And I was like, we can't really be a part of this community with bylaws that read like this. Like we'll never be fully a part of this community if this is how we're going to engage. And you're never gonna attract leadership. No leader wants to be tied to these kind of stipulations and this kind of oversight. We want some freedom and some liberty, some trust to be able to do the work that you've hired us to do. So, and I agree, there's been those tough conversations too. Another example is in our general music education program, we teach kids general music on buckets, like literally buckets from Home Depot. We use drumsticks to beat on buckets. The kids do all these call and repeat patterns. They love it. I have board members come to me like, I just don't like the connotation that comes along with our kids beating on buckets. I've seen homeless people in the Detroit community beat on buckets. And I was like, what? Like it took everything I had to craft a fitting response. But where I landed is that you need to question why you are seeing issue with the buckets. Not that we're really problematic by using the buckets, but why have you associated that with something so negative that you can't see the positive in it for what we're doing in our program here? To me, those are the kind of tough conversations, right? Causing and forcing donors, our board members to look within and figure out for themselves why they're challenged by certain things. To me, it's not my job to make you feel comfortable with the buckets. That's internal work you need to do, right? But these are the type of conversations we have to have. I could go on and on. There's so many examples, from the fact that we're partnered with the school district here in the city of Pontiac. And to me, the Pontiac School District is the bigger community partner. When I look at the bylaws, the agreement, not bylaws, the MOU that we had with the school district, when I came on board, I was like, I can't believe they signed this. Like it had so many negative connotations. It clearly put our organization in the sort of hierarchical position as if we were doing the school district a favor by providing this program. It said all wrong with me. And I entered that meeting with the superintendent and I led with that. I read these bylaws and for me, they don't read partnership and I want to apologize for that. And then I changed everything about that MOU that didn't read partnership, that didn't respect the position that the school district had, that didn't give them permit. It just, again, I changed it. I made sure it read partnership after we were done. And after that meeting, the superintendent initiated a transportation partnership for our organization that we have been trying to get for 7 years. So to me, when you do those kind of things that center on community, it's helpful for the organization all the way around. So now we have a real partnership with the school district where they're thinking about ways they can help us improve our programming and improve our delivery. And we're thinking about ways that we can be helpful to the district as well. So.
Mm-hmm. You talked about something else there, Sommer, too, that's so important. It's like in terms of like seeking community feedback. So this is in response to the last question a little bit, but like when you're taking actions, how much is the community truly informing your work and how much are you really accepting all feedback, good and bad? And like, are you actively seeking it? Are you absorbing it? Are you following up on it? And are you making changes? And then are you following up to say, hey, we've made these changes as a result of your feedback? So if it's like community centric, then it's really not. Most organizations that I've worked with in my experience, I'm also in Canada, maybe a little different, but even in the US, do not necessarily always have truly boards that are comprised like a representative board is what you might call that. And so then you have people making decisions that may not necessarily have a lot of knowledge of some of the issues. They might have expertise in a like a functional area, like, you know, finance or law or whatever the case might be. We are like, we need an accountant, we need a lawyer, we need this, we need that. And then what the community experience drives all of those decisions. And so it's like the board or even the management team may not always be just appropriate to make all the decisions. And yet who usually drives the strategic planning work and whose input is usually most heavily weighed. So with some of the CCF things around, how do we like lessen that hierarchy piece? How do we have everyone's voice speak? Well, it's like we're collecting feedback at every possible opportunity, and we sit there and we read every single piece of feedback that comes in. We identify themes. We take quantitative and qualitative measures. We're like asking young kids, what do you actually think of this? And doing focus groups and doing that. And this all tough takes effort and time. So I get why it doesn't always happen, but the richness of that you receive and then the resulting work that you do, that also was helpful for our fundraising as well, in terms of how we communicate our work and what we say in terms of like, how do communities feel about how do the communities we claim to serve feel about the work we're putting out there and the fundraising communications we're putting out there. Like everyone needs to be involved in this. So coming down to even the redefining of our mission statement to like how programs run, that was all heavily driven by community, and the whole team was always like so hungry for that feedback, and it was almost exciting to see the kinds of cool ideas and things that came up. So yes, you can never, we're in a hierarchy, you can't take away the board and the management sort of influence on the organization, but if it's being heavily informed and truly genuinely informed through community work, that's another way that I've really been striving for as a result of some of the influence of CCF as well.
Yeah, I agree, Rickesh. Thank you for adding that. I think about here at my organization, a lot of my staff members live right here in the city of Pontiac. But to me, even that's not enough to really get the voice of the community, right? So when I think about our strategic planning efforts, we have this whole marketing workshop coming up. I'm inviting students. I got a student intern who will participate. I've solicited a parent and asked for her participation because all of those voices matter. And then like, I'm going to throw this question out there because I kind of need some help. You know, one of the things I've been dealing with organizationally is adding a strings music component to our program. Board members want to see kids in the low-income community playing violins. And so I'm like, nobody in our community is asking for violins. Like, we're not adding violins simply because our board members want to add violins. Like, to me, there has to be a community desire for violins, right? So I've gotten a few emails, like I've gotten a couple emails from parents in the community. One woman emailed me, says she has twin boys that play the violin and wanted to know if they could participate in our program. I let her know we didn't have a strings component. I got another inquiry, maybe two, but I'm just like, what's the definition of community interest, right? When do I have enough community members kind of raising their hand and saying, this is something we'd like to see, to justify me adding that as a program component, right? So right now I'm just tracking the data, right? It feels good that I'm at least keeping track of it, but I'm like, what's going to be like my pivot point? How many do I need to get before I say, you know what, we do need to add a strings component? So I'm just trying to pull that out to our CCF community because I feel like I'm creating this on my own, like, so I don't know what the real answer is.
Great. And I think this question is for folks who aren't in a leadership position within their organization, but are trying to see CCF implemented by leadership. Do you all have any advice for how you can, in positions of leadership, to start incorporating CCF?
This was like probably, I'm not even sure, I don't know the composition of the audience, but like a lot of folks are probably just itching for this. It's like, how many times if we're working with folks and they are in a relatively, at least in the hierarchy, in a junior position, they're a coordinator, manager, maybe even a director, and they have all these changes that they want to make, and they're really committed to it. They understand it. They've gotten buy-in from team members and others. They're taking tangible steps toward it, showing that it's working. And then where's the block come, right? So I almost like want to change the word from how can you influence leadership to how can you influence management, because leadership can happen in so many levels of the org. But like, yeah, it's often the board, the ED, the CEO that is like the blocker, right? It's just, again, I'm talking about, I understand those roles are very complex. They have a lot of things to deal with, but it's like when the leader comes forward and says, we want to make these kinds of changes, invites everybody to spend all this time talking about it, brainstorming, coming up with ideas. The ideas come back and they're like, we can't do that, or oh, that sounds good, and then they don't do anything with it. That's I see happening in so many organizations. So people get frustrated. Or the other thing happens where they they try to do this kind of work and then they're penalized for it, which is also not okay. Where they're like, oh, you're trying to stir the pot, we're gonna just remove you from this organization. We're gonna stop inviting you to meetings. We're gonna like push you out of the org. That happens too for people that are so-called disruptors or change, people trying to make these core changes, because then people have to question some very interesting things about the organization, and that shame response must kick in because people do not want to go to those places. So I feel like we have to be mindful of this dynamic, and just as we're operating, that this dynamic is inherently in place because of the nature of hierarchies. Fair or not, it's what we're working with. So like my advice is like, first of all, you have to know how your leader thinks. Like I like there's something called the DISC profile. There's like DISC. D is like dominant, I is like influencer, S is like supportive, and C is like an analytical. And so if you've got like an analytical person, you could talk to them all day about why you need to put more efforts into like building donor relationships, and they're just not going to care. Whereas if they're a C type, and I come in and say, this happened in my organization, we're like, did like a small sample size of like, hey, we did this particular initiative with this level of donors, this number of donors, and here's the difference in donor retention rate. And so we want to now like scope that out to the whole group. So we ended up trying to reach, I think we had 13,000 donors we were working with, and we tried to reach every single one of them personally, every single one. And I loved calling a $10 donor. And this is part of the community centric fundraising, is who are we even acknowledge and feel like, oh, we got to only go towards the big money. It's like, well, that $10 person receiving that phone call, they are absolutely blown away by that. But it took an organization-wide effort to sort of make that happen. And I had to have some of that data in place. But after doing that, the next year, we increased donor retention by 10%. And it was like, that raised another $150,000. And that was just through basically creating those good relationships. So like, you have to know how your leader thinks. And then you also have to be able to come to like you're talking about, Sommer, measuring and tracking some of this stuff, have that sort of data handy. And then also in a management group or in a board, I would always say, like, find out who your champions are, because chances are there's at least one or two people that really do agree with what you're talking about. If you can find these champions and then get them activated and have a bit more of a kind of peer-to-peer approach. Again, this is a hierarchy thing. You got to work the channels, and they can be a champion for it. So it's not always you, because you may not be comfortable doing that, or you may not feel like that's where you can have the influence. But find these champions and have them be the ones doing some of that influence on your behalf. Get them on board, and hopefully it is someone like a CEO or a board chair. Sometimes it's someone else random in those kinds of roles. And so I think those are really, really critical, especially if they've said that they want to embrace this and they want to go forward with it. That's the vehicle to say, hey, I want to see us make those things come to light. So let's actually, here's some actions we can take that'll actually take us there. But then the last thing I always say, this is always the last thing. At some point, so many people have asked me this exact question. I'm frustrated. What do I do if management's not listening to me? I'm trying to make these changes. They're not supporting. They're not showing up when they need to. And they're actually like pushing back against me. And I do have to say, I'm not advocating for people to leave your organization on a whim. And I get it, that's a luxury to even make that decision. But at some point, if you really want to make these changes, sometimes you may just not be in the right environment to do it. If the ED and the board are not going to make not going to like play ball, then it's really, really hard. You can make your corner of the organization better for sure, and I encourage you to do that. But if you're trying to make big level changes, they do have to be involved, and that's a stickier part. There's no easy answer to that, unfortunately.
Jennifer, I see you've got your hand up. Do you have a question?
It wasn't a question. I actually just wanted to, after I raised my hand, you said what I wanted to say, which was about the champions in the room, because that idea that these principles can be derailed so quickly, especially in board or at leadership level. So CCF has to be part of every agenda, and it needs to be represented by people with different roles at the organization. So actually inviting your funders and having transparent fundraisers and allowing others in the organization to not always be the ones sticking out their neck, but to know that if the conversation gets derailed and people go back into scarcity mindset, at the board level, trying to somehow take fundraising out of the equation of becoming more socially responsible, but let's not change fundraising because we're afraid that it won't work. So it takes, you do have to have those champions to put the conversation back on track and to protect the runway that you need to make those changes.
I'll just add to what Rickesh said. And I want to say too that I realize that my organization is in a very privileged situation. And I realize that it's easier for me to make certain judgments, certain recommendations, knowing that we have reserves in the bank, and everyone is certainly not in that situation. So I first want to acknowledge that. The second thing I want to say is that as I came into a leadership role for this organization, I previously spent 2 years as a member of the board of directors. In fact, as I took the interim executive director role, I was supposed to be incoming board president, and then shifted. So I've been very, very privileged in that I already have a working relationship with the board of directors, right? So we brought in a couple of new board members since then, but there's already a level of trust there. There's already a level of years of building a relationship and building that trust. So I'm going to say that I recognize that my path forward on some of these things and issues has been a lot different. But I think the key things are the authenticity that comes from having a real relationship with leadership or management, and sort of living and breathing it, right? Leading by example and not swaying, right? And another thing I want to say is that, like, as I learned about community centric fundraising back while I was still a fundraiser, before I joined the Global Council, and I was just coming up on the principles, probably as many of you did. My advice to myself has always been to take it slow. You don't have to flip the switch and go from not being a community centric organization to doing everything community centric the very next day. Like, you can take baby steps. You can think about what principles are going to be the easiest ones for me to get across. And then I think about all movements, right? Think about social change movements that have happened throughout history and throughout time. They've all taken a very long time. They've all been really expensive, kind of things to implement. So, going slow doesn't mean we're not going. So my advice has always been to do what you can in the community centric space, and, just sort of always be moving towards being more and more community centric every day.
Great. That was the end of the pre-established questions. Any questions from folks? I have been neglecting the chat, but are there any questions from the chat that we want to highlight in the last 9 minutes?
I didn't put a question in the chat, but I had a question of just like kind of to the point that Sommer was just saying of like slowly implementing more and more principles and like how to navigate that, and like the fact that our organization's operating within capitalism but yet wanting to be anti-capitalist, and how you manage that with your funders. And I think we're getting to a point of like, we're a heavily government grant based organization trying to shift more and more to like unrestricted sources of revenue, like individuals and corporate donors and things like that. So we're like actively working on that through the CCF lens, but also like thinking about corporate partners and corporate funders, or even just like private funders, and them not being like fully ethical for the sense that they simply exist within capitalism. Like, how I've had a hard time discerning, like, do we starve those funders by like collectively saying we're not going to accept your funding because you don't stand for what we stand for? Or do we like try to reclaim that funding and like reallocate that back to our communities when it's being taken? Or like, yeah, I think I've just had a struggle of like what do we do when we kind of rely on these like corporate or private funders that maybe don't always fully align, but those are like kind of our sources. So I don't know, I'm curious what people think and like how they have approached that. And like we do have a system to determine whether or not a funder aligns with us, but I still think there's gaps with like truly what we believe and like how we want to be supported. So yeah.
That's a tough one, but I'll add what I can to it. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about some of our supporters is that the first thing I think is that we're able to put corporate funders through a sort of lens or evaluation process that we're unable to do for individual supporters. So to me, there's already some inequity and some unfairness in that. And I bet if we dig deep enough into the roots of anybody's wealth, we're going to find something uncomfortable, right? And then I want to say that I do commend some corporate philanthropy, and that it recognizes the wrong that it's done as part of its reason for giving back today, right? So I think corporate philanthropy has come a long way, in that in the past it was a lot around marketing budgets, right? Like they're just looking for exposure. They want to be associated with your organization's good name. But I feel like a lot of corporate foundations are moving towards, righting the wrongs that they've done as a corporation. And to me, that's what makes it okay, right? If we're doing corporate philanthropy and we haven't taken account for the wrong that we've done to society, but are instead just trying to, put a Band-Aid over it, or to give some support, or to just kind of like erase the fact that we've done all this wrong and harm. One I can think of that's standing out to me is Dow Chemical Company. I had a whole debate with somebody about support from Dow Chemical. And I'm like, they recognize that they've been unfair and harmful to communities of color, to low-income places with, sort of their products and their factories or whatever the case. And I'm like, it'd be different if they were doing this work and not acknowledging that. So to me, the acknowledgement of it is a big part of what makes it okay to accept the fund.
Thank you for that. Like super, like that's a really helpful example, Summer, to like a real situation that's come up. And this is like, I think part of what I would add to this is like, we're dealing with money, power, wealth. It's imperfect. And that's something we sometimes struggle with. We kind of see it as a binary. And I mean, if I'm very impatient, so I'm like, I just want to like, just turn it all upside down. And that's not the realities that we are in, because we could then actually might in the process unintentionally cause harm to the work we're doing, to team members, to programming. And so I've been working with I work with organizations. This is what we do. We talk about the values alignment piece. And yes, you can have a gift acceptance policy. That's important. Sure, absolutely. And also, how does that, again, the day-to-day behavior, how does it play out when a donor is problematic, when a company does something publicly that is not aligned with what your organization is doing? You have to make those decisions and really be clear on where your line is, and then say, no matter what amount of money we get, we're not going to cross that line. I think that's where I see people run into problems, is they haven't had the conversations internally as to what is the line in terms of what money we will accept and not. So whether it is in a gift acceptance policy or in some kind of like procedure or whatever it is, you have to know that, and then know when it surfaces. And then that's when you have the tough discussion, say, wow, that's a lot of money, but we said we're going to stick to this. And so let's make it, let's make that happen. It's a very tough conversation, because we are in this scarcity mindset where we're like, oh, I can't turn funding down. We need money. I got to run programs. All these people are knocking on our doors. And sometimes that makes us make rash decisions. So I think it's taking some space aside from the day-to-day and having that intentional conversation about what aligns and what doesn't. And also, to be honest, being mindful of cherry picking specific companies, and not sometimes, because like I know one organization was like, we don't want to work with this bank because they invest in oil and gas heavily. It's like, but then you have to then say, we're not going to invest in any of the banks, because they're all investing in oil and gas heavily. Just because that one is number one, it doesn't mean, so then you have to make some of those decisions and lines. And maybe it's like, you're not going to do it all in one day. But if your goal is to reduce funding from this particular area, or remove corporate fundraising from your mix, if that is your goal, you have to do it in an intentional way that's kind of maybe over time and kind of like staggered, because you also don't want to probably, I mean, you may say, no, well, we're going to turn this $100,000 down that we accepted last year. It's going to mean we're going to have to make some changes to programming and staff. And if that's your strategic decision, is what it is. It's just have those intentional conversations now before the decision comes to your desk is what I would suggest, and be very, very clear on your values and what crosses that line.
Yeah,
It's not
those have
perfect. It's not
been super
perfect.
helpful. Yeah, those have been super helpful. And I feel that like what you were saying about the binary, I feel like that hits home with me of like, okay, yeah, like these are all like bad in some sense. Like it's not fully aligned, but like having a red line and like having those intentional conversations and like making changes over time. So yeah, that was super helpful. Thank you.
We've only got 2 minutes, but there was one question that about, are there any tips for startup organizations to instill CCF principles from the beginning? Maybe for each of you to respond to that.
So I remember being at AFP Icon. This must have been in, I don't know, 2021 or maybe it was 22, the years, pandemic years all run together. But it was the one in Las Vegas. And I had a fundraiser come up to me after I gave a presentation, and she said to me, all I've ever known is community centric fundraising. She's like, this is the only way I've ever fundraised. And I immediately was like envious and jealous, and like, here I am unlearning 25 years of crap, donor centric fundraising crap that I've had forced down my throat for the last 25 years. But you know, I think the CCF movement is breeding more and more of this, right? So I feel like we're gonna get to a point where we're not even gonna have to name it. It just is how we operate, right? And that's my real vision. And I'm hoping that startups can come with that kind of vigor. And like, this is just how we operate, right? We are a community centric organization, and this is just how we do it. It's not being looked at as a change or doing something different. So my advice would be, especially if you're a startup, it starts from those first 3 board members you list on your articles of incorporation application when you're trying to become a 501c3. You need to be sure, right? Don't just pick folks that, oh, I need 3 people. Let me just find my 3 buddies and the 3 people I know to be my board members. But you have to be intentional, is the point I'm trying to make. Think about that that alignment, that desire to be a community-centric organization, and lead with that as you're recruiting the first people to be involved with your organization. That's what I would do if I ever had the chance. Oh, we're going to get kicked off. Thanks, everybody.